Stuart Robert, welcome to the program. Let's just start on this point of confusion, as Labor puts it. The Health Minister says the international border may not open even if the whole country is vaccinated. The Prime Minister says the border may open for some who've been fully vaccinated. They might be able to use home quarantine. So can you just clear this up for us? Which is it?
Well, the Prime Minister, David, always speaks for the country, first of all, and the PM's made it quite clear that there are options to start moving forward to open the borders, depending upon working with the states. And of course, once we get the medical advice as to whether the COVID virus can be transmitted if someone has been vaccinated or previously had the virus, all of those are determinant.
So obviously the states have to agree, but the federal government's preference is that if you're fully vaccinated, you should be able to travel abroad and then home quarantine.
Well, that was what the Prime Minister said. That was the point he made, that would make logical sense in the first step. But again, we need to work with states and territories on this. They're the ones that are managing quarantines. And of course, we need to ensure that borders stay open. Your point is right, the states have to agree to this, but is the federal government's view, is what I'm trying to get to here, that you could do this before the whole population is vaccinated? Would it just be the elderly and vulnerable protected, then you could start having this sort of travel? Well, these are the points the Prime Minister made, that moving for Australians who are vaccinated more quickly to be able to travel overseas and come back again, perhaps with home quarantine,
so before
would be
the whole
a logical
population,
first step.
Yeah, before the whole population is necessarily vaccinated.
And that was what the Prime Minister was pointing out as possible next steps, depending upon working with the states and territories.
I guess one of the concerns about home quarantine is how do you ensure people stay at home, don't have visitors at home? You can do that at a hotel, but how do you do it with home quarantine?
And these are the challenges with home quarantine, and we saw that in the early days of the Victorian lockdown, and all of that will need to be worked through, David, before a policy prescription goes live.
So what sort of ideas would there be for this? Regular visits, inspections to make sure they're home, ankle bracelets, some sort of monitoring? How do you do it?
Well, if you think about, I spent 3 or 4 months in home quarantine as we travelled as a Cabinet Minister during the pandemic last year as an agreement between the state and the federal government, as did a number of my other Cabinet colleagues. The police would turn up at random times to our house. They would call. The Department of Health of respective jurisdictions would call. They were some of the measures that were put in place to deal with that exact issue. And
when the Prime Minister says we may have to get used to having 1,000 cases a week in Australia once enough people are vaccinated, what do you understand he's talking about there? Do you think people will be comfortable with that?
One of the challenges, of course, is if we vaccinate the population, it's voluntary. We'd hope that the vast majority of Australians would be vaccinated. But if only 80% are vaccinated, or 90%, you would still have 10% who are not vaccinated over the age of 18 and therefore unprotected. And that leaves open the opportunity, unfortunately, for COVID to still roll through the community. And that's just a reality of when people have choices, as they should in Australia.
So you think at that point it's okay to open up the border and allow about 1,000 cases a week?
Well, these are the conversations we're going to have, and this is the point the Prime Minister was making, which is why National Cabinet is now moving.
Would you be comfortable with that, 1,000 cases a week?
It's not a matter of what I'll be comfortable with, it's a matter of what we can actually work with the states and territories on and what the Australian people will accept. Now, we'll need to continue with the vaccine rollout, make sensible decisions as we go in terms of opening our international borders to allow Australians to freely move in and out, also to allow skilled migration, which will become important, as well as international students. And all of those questions we'll have to work through. It's why National Cabinet is now meeting twice a week, almost on a war footing, if you like, to quote some commentators, to ensure these questions are all flushed out.
Let's talk about the jobs figures. There was more strong jobs growth last month before the withdrawal of JobKeeper. You've been talking this week about how well the plan is going. What do you say to those who can't find work right now? Their jobs rate at 5.6%, participation at 66.3%. The numbers are pleasing but cautiously optimistic.
However, we also understand that Australians are doing it tough. There's no question about that. There are some really encouraging signs, David. We're seeing the highest rate of job advertisements, at least in 12 years. So there's certainly work out there, and the anecdotal evidence I get from employers is they're struggling to find skilled people. My encouragement for Australians looking for work is we have Job Trainer, 300,000 places people can enrol in till September this year to get the skills they need, and I'd encourage all Australians, if they're looking to reskill, Job Trainer is the perfect opportunity. And for those who wish to go into apprenticeships, 100,000 apprenticeships, which the Commonwealth is covering 50% of it. So we are very focused in terms of getting the skills to Australians so they can take up positions that are available.
I note you didn't mention their job maker. This was one of the centrepiece elements of last year's, or the October budget, the $200 a week subsidy to hire someone under the age of 35. There's been, well, it hasn't exactly worked, has it? By now there should have been 10,000 jobs supported. It turns out only about 600 or so have been. Does that need to be reworked? Should it be available to those over the age of 35 as well?
Again, we won't get ahead of ourselves in the budget context, David. We'll wait and see what the Treasurer's got to say in that respect. But there's a range of measures, like bricks in a wall, if you will. And the Job Trainer program has been extraordinarily well taken up, as has apprenticeships. And a range of these programs will continue to try different approaches to encourage Australians to get into work. You can't say it's been well
taken up, can you? If it was meant to be 10,000 by now and it's 600.
Well, the take-up in the JobMaker hiring credit has been lower, but the take-up in apprenticeships and Job Trainer has been faster than we thought. So again, policy prescriptions all working together.
Let me ask you about Christina Holgate. Did you share the Prime Minister's view that it was appalling and disgraceful that she gave Cartier watches to employees worth around $20,000?
I'm not going to get into the Christine Holgate issue. It's one job. I've got to focus on 13,077,000 jobs.
I think the key issue here try to avoid it there, Minister. Sorry, but this has been a pretty prominent issue during the week. I'm just wondering if you shared your Prime Minister's view at the time that what she did was appalling and disgraceful.
I wasn't close enough to it, David, wasn't close enough to the issues, and nor am I across the degrees to which the government business enterprise can do or cannot do. It's not a lot to be across here. It's not a detailed question. She bought some Cartier watches for 4 employees. They were worth 20 grand in total. Was that appalling? It was probably unwise for a government business enterprise to do that. I think that point's been well made. And then, of course, it was independently investigated.
OK, well, if it was unwise, or to use the Prime Minister's words, appalling and disgraceful, what about the NBN and the bonuses they paid just in the last 6 months of last year? $77 million in bonuses. Is that unwise or indeed appalling?
Oh, you can't conflate the two, and the Communications Minister has made it very clear that the entire remuneration package of NBN is completely separate, in fact mostly set in the Labor days, and those bonuses, you say, are actually an integral part of the remuneration packages that were set, entirely separate to a bonus structure like you saw in Australia Post.
All right, well, what about something that you had direct involvement in, and that was the $1.2 billion settlement of the Robodebt class action? Was that an appalling waste of money? It
was, unfortunately, a 30-year practice where the use of average income data from the ATO, frankly, wasn't sufficient. And until this government actually got advice to say it wasn't sufficient, and therefore funds were actually paid back. It was a long-standing practice of government that just turned out to be incorrect.
But there was no inquiry into this. No one had to stand aside. You didn't have to stand aside. Isn't there a double standard here where Christine Holgate, $20,000 worth of watches, has to stand aside and be subject to a review and inquiry, a $1.2 billion settlement for Robodebt, and no one pays a price?
Again, David, they're very different issues. In terms of the income compliance program, Robodebt, that was a long-standing program over 30 years that had followed exactly the same way of doing things.
Well,
the use of average income data...
Only to a degree, Minister. Sorry to jump in there, but I've got to correct that, because we know Scott Morrison and Christian Porter in 2016 proudly boasted that they were ramping up the Robodebt scheme. They were expanding its use quite considerably.
They were on exactly the same terms as the program had been used 25 years previously, on exactly the same basis,
but removing that human element,
at a larger scale.
Removing that human oversight.
There was always human oversight, It was just the use of computing matching on income compliance as opposed to being done previously entirely by humans. But there was still a person in that chain, David. But suffice to say that that was a continuation of a long-standing program that had been well accepted and well used by governments over 30 years.
Let me ask you finally about your legacy in your previous job as the Minister for the NDIS. Part of what you wanted to do there was to introduce mandatory independent assessments for NDIS participants. Is that now dead in the water under the new minister?
I'll let Minister Reynolds speak for herself, but remember, David, independent assessments were a core part of the Productivity Commission's review in 2011. John Walsh, the father of the scheme, if you like, is passionate for them. He was one of the authors of the 2011 Productivity Commission report. David Choon also reiterated it. This is about equity. This is ensuring that someone in the northern Tasmania in Devonport who gets an $80,000 plan, as opposed to in the seat of Hobart gets a $105,000 plan.
So it still will happen?
The
These independent assessments will still happen?
The independent assessments, David, were always intended to be part of the NDIS. That was always the intent. We're now on the second trial over the last 2.5 years. I've read Minister Reynolds' public statements that saying she's waiting to the end of the current trial, which will be in the coming months. So I guess we'll find out then.
Sounds like they will still go ahead.
Say again, David?
Sounds like they will still go ahead.
Well, that was the original design of the scheme, David. That's exactly how the Productivity Commission designed the scheme to be.
All right, Stuart Robert, thanks for joining us.
Great to talk to you.